The early morning mist hovered over Pine Lake like a protective blanket, turning the water into liquid silver. I stood on the deck of my cabin, coffee mug warming my hands as I watched the sun begin its climb over the eastern ridge. This place had been my sanctuary for 5 years now, though the cabin itself had stood for nearly 40. My grandfather built it with his own hands back in the 70s, a labor of love that took him 3 summers of weekends and 2 full winters to complete. Every beam had a story. The hardwood floors came from trees that fell during the big storm of 1982. The stone fireplace contained rocks my father and I had collected from the property over decades. The stained glass window above the front door was crafted by my mother, depicting the view of the lake at sunset. This was not just a structure of wood and stone. This was my family legacy, my connection to those who came before me, and my refuge from the world. The cabin sat on 3 acres of woodland that sloped gently down to a small private beach on the north shore. Pine trees surrounded the property, providing privacy and filling the air with their crisp scent. Behind the main structure stood a small boathouse where my grandfather's restored wooden rowboat waited for lazy summer afternoons. A winding stone path connected everything, hand-laid by 3 generations of my family. I had no idea Pine Lake had even formed a homeowners association until the letter arrived 4 months ago. Apparently, the wealthy new residents on the South Shore had initiated it, claiming standardization would protect property values and ensure quality of community. My cabin had been grandfathered in, which meant I could not be forced to make major structural changes, but was still subject to community standards maintenance. The first inspection came 3 days after the notification. That was when I met Corinne Matthews. She arrived in a white Range Rover, dressed in what appeared to be safari-inspired designer wear despite the casual lake setting. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun, and oversized sunglasses hid her eyes as she examined my property with visible distaste. "You must be the owner of Lot 17, she said, not extending her hand or introducing herself. Her clipboard already had notes scribbled across it, though she had been there less than a minute. "Yes, I am Thomas Whitaker. This has been my family property for 40 years, and you are." Corinne Matthews, Pine Lake HOA president. She gestured toward my hand-carved welcome sign. "That will need to be removed. Signs must follow regulation dimensions and approved fonts. Section 4, Paragraph 3 of the bylaws." I blinked in surprise. This sign was carved by my grandfather. It has been here longer than most of the houses on this lake. Corinne made another note on her clipboard. "Grandfather clauses apply to structures, not decorative elements. You have 14 days to comply." She moved past me toward the cabin itself. "Those wind chimes will also need to be removed, and that bird feeder violates our wildlife management protocols." She continued her inspection, finding fault with practically everything that made my cabin unique. The natural stone path was irregular and potentially hazardous. My collection of native plants was uncultivated vegetation. The weathered blue paint on the shutters was not from the approved color palette. As she left, I noticed her pausing at the edge of my property, taking photos with her phone and making a call. Through the open window of her car, I heard her say, "Yes, it has the best location on the lake. Completely unobstructed view. Once we get rid of that eyesore, you could fit at least 3 luxury units on that lot." A cold feeling settled in my stomach as I watched her drive away. This was not just about rules and regulations. This was about something much worse, someone coveting what was mine. The manila envelopes began arriving weekly after that first inspection. Each one bore the official Pine Lake HOA letterhead and contained new citations for violations I never knew existed. I stood in my kitchen, hands trembling with frustration as I read the latest notice. According to Karen Matthews, my bird feeder disrupted the aesthetic continuity of the lakefront and needed to be removed immediately or I would face daily fines of $50. I had already removed the wind chimes, repainted the shutters in an approved shade of navy blue that looked almost identical to my original color, and replaced my grandfather's hand-carved sign with a standardized plaque that felt soulless against the rustic wood of my cabin. Each change felt like erasing a piece of my family history, but I complied to avoid the mounting fines that threatened my ownership of the property. The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew my attention to the window. An old Ford pickup had pulled into my driveway, and my neighbor Frank Miller stepped out. Frank owned the cabin about a quarter-mile down the shore, a place his family had built around the same time as mine. His weathered face looked even more lined than usual as he approached my door. "Got another one of these today," he said without preamble, holding up an envelope identical to mine. "Third this month. They want me to tear down the boat dock my father built because it extends 2 feet further into the water than the new regulations allow." I invited him in and poured us both coffee at my kitchen table. We spread our violation notices side by side, comparing the increasingly absurd demands from the HOA. "Sarah Thornton over on Pine Ridge got one too," Frank said, stirring sugar into his mug. "And the Johnsons. Notice a pattern. All of us are original cabin owners. None of those new mansion monstrosities on the South Shore have received a single citation." Later that week, more neighbors arrived. The Pattersons brought homemade bread. The Wilsons brought beer. Everyone brought their HOA violation notices. We gathered on my deck overlooking the lake, sharing stories of increasingly aggressive enforcement actions targeting only the original cabin owners. "I saw them yesterday," said Margaret Patterson, an elderly woman who had summered at Pine Lake for 60 years. "Karen and her board members were giving a tour to some men in expensive suits. They stopped right in front of your place, Thomas, pointing and making big gestures like real estate agents showing prime property." I grabbed my binoculars from inside and spent the next morning watching the lake. Sure enough, around 11, Karen's white Range Rover appeared on the community road that circled the lake. She stopped directly across from my property, exiting with 3 men in business attire. Even from this distance, I could see her pointing repeatedly at my cabin while the men nodded and made notes. That afternoon, I drove to Mason's General Store for supplies. Joe Mason had run the store for 30 years and knew everything that happened around Pine Lake. As I paid for my groceries, he leaned across the counter and lowered his voice. "Thought you should know, Thomas. That HOA president was in here with some developer types yesterday. Overheard her talking about cleaning up the North Shore. Specifically mentioned your location as prime real estate. Said something about how the current eyesore would be gone within the year." My stomach tightened. She actually said that about my cabin. Joe nodded grimly. "Said they had plans for luxury condominiums, 3-story waterfront units starting at $1 million each. She seemed quite confident your property would be available soon." I drove home slowly, the realization finally dawning that this harassment was not random or personal. It was strategic. My cabin sat on the most desirable parcel of waterfront on the entire lake. The only thing standing between Karen Matthews and her development plans was me and my family legacy. The violations, the fines, the constant pressure, all designed to force me to sell. That night I sat on my deck watching the sunset paint the lake in golds and purples. A pair of loons called to each other across the water, their haunting cries echoing off the surrounding hills. This place was not just property. It was irreplaceable. It was home. And I was not about to let some developer with a clipboard take it from me without a fight. As darkness fell over Pine Lake, I made a silent promise to my grandfather and to myself. Karen Matthews had no idea who she was dealing with. If she wanted a war over this cabin, she would get one. Rain pounded against the windows of my cabin, matching the drumming of my heart as I read the community newsletter that had arrived that morning. The glossy paper featured a smiling photo of Karen Matthews announcing the annual HOA board retreat scheduled for the following weekend. What caught my eye was not the announcement itself, but the small paragraph beneath it. As part of our ongoing community education efforts, the board will conduct inspection tour of selected properties that demonstrate challenges to our community standards. These educational visits will help board members better understand enforcement priorities for the coming year. Below this paragraph was a list of properties scheduled for educational inspection. My cabin was highlighted as the primary example, described as Property 17 North Shore, multiple unresolved violations. The mandatory community meeting was scheduled for that evening at the new Lakeside Pavilion. I had skipped previous meetings, finding the bureaucratic power plays depressing, but this news made attendance essential. I arrived early, choosing a seat near the back behind a large support column where I could observe without being immediately noticed. The meeting proceeded with tedious discussions of landscaping requirements and approved mailbox designs. I was about to leave when Karen called for a brief recess before discussing the upcoming board retreat. Most residents filtered outside for refreshments, but I remained seated, half hidden by the column. Karen huddled with 4 board members near the podium, speaking in low tones. I could not hear everything, but her voice occasionally rose as she became more animated. "The North Shore is our priority for Phase 2 development," she said, pointing to something on her tablet. "We have investors ready, but that eyesore cabin at Lot 17 is the linchpin. Once we control that property, the others will fall in line." A balding man in an expensive suit nodded. "How long before the current owner caves?" Karen laughed, the sound sharp and confident. "Not long. The fines are accumulating and we have found 27 violations so far, but the retreat will be our masterstroke. We will use that eyesore cabin for our after-party. The owner never attends these meetings anyway. We will document every violation in person, then push for maximum enforcement. By summer, it will be ours." Another board member spoke too quietly for me to hear, but Karen's response was clear. "Of course I have a key. As HOA president, I have access rights for inspection purposes. The bylaws are quite clear." My blood ran cold. They were planning to enter my home without permission, to use my property for their party, all while documenting violations to justify forcing me out. The room seemed to spin around me as residents began returning to their seats. I slipped out before anyone noticed me and waited in the parking lot. The rain had intensified, drumming on the roof of my truck as I watched the pavilion doors. When the meeting ended, Karen emerged surrounded by board members, all hurrying toward their vehicles under shared umbrellas. I intercepted her near her Range Rover. "Ms. Matthews, a word, please." She startled, then composed herself. "Mr. Whittaker, how unexpected. You rarely attend our community functions." "I want to discuss your plans to use my cabin for your board retreat after party," I said, watching her expression carefully. A brief flash of surprise crossed her face before her professional mask returned. "I have no idea what you mean. The board retreat is a private function at the community pavilion." I heard you discussing your plans to enter my property without permission. That would be trespassing. Karen clutched her clipboard to her chest like armor. Rain plastered her blonde hair to her head despite the umbrella held by a nervous board member beside her. As HOA president, I have inspection rights clearly defined in Section 12 of the bylaws. Perhaps if maintaining community standards is too difficult for you, you should consider selling. I happen to know several interested parties who would pay fair market value for such a unique property. My cabin is not for sale, I said, my voice leveled despite the anger building inside me. And fair warning, do not enter my property without express written permission. Her smile turned cold. Threatening an HOA official could result in additional fines, Mr. Whitaker. I suggest you review your bylaws more carefully. This conversation is over. She brushed past me to her vehicle. As she pulled away, I caught her speaking into her phone. Call Maxwell Development. Tell them we may have our problem property available sooner than expected. The drive home through the storm mirrored my internal turmoil. Rain lashed at my windshield while thunder rumbled across the lake. This was no longer about petty rules or community standards. This was calculated theft of something irreplaceable, something precious to me. As I parked outside my cabin, lightning illuminated the structure in a brief, brilliant flash. The hand-built walls, the stone chimney, the weathered deck where 3 generations of my family had gathered to watch sunsets and count stars. They would not take this from me. Instead of helpless rage, a strange calm settled over me as I entered my home. If Karen Matthews wanted access to my cabin so badly, perhaps she should experience the true nature of this rustic lifestyle, complete with all its inconveniences. If she planned to trespass with her board members, perhaps they deserved a proper welcome. A plan began forming in my mind. Not revenge exactly, but justice, delivered with surgical precision. The hardware store in town was my first stop the next morning. Harold Jenkins had owned it for 30 years and raised an eyebrow at my unusual shopping list but asked no questions as I filled my cart methodically. Motion sensors, wildlife cameras, industrial dye packets typically used for marking trees, remote switches, various mechanical components that individually seemed innocent enough. Doing some security upgrades at your cabin? He asked as he rang up my purchases. Something like that, I replied, adding a few rolls of fishing line to my pile. Just some precautionary measures. Harold nodded sagely. Heard about those break-ins over on Eagle Point last month. Smart to be prepared. Next came the electronics store in the neighboring town, where I purchased wireless cameras with cloud storage capabilities. The sporting goods store provided me with additional supplies. By afternoon, my truck was filled with everything I needed to prepare for unwanted visitors. Back at the cabin, I spread blueprints across my dining table and began planning with surgical precision. The beauty of my strategy was its simplicity. Nothing illegal, nothing dangerous. Just a series of embarrassing inconveniences designed to activate when certain boundaries were crossed. First came research. I spent hours online studying property protection laws in our state. I discovered that while booby traps designed to cause harm were illegal, security measures that caused inconvenience or embarrassment were perfectly within my rights as a property owner. I documented everything in a journal labeled Home Security Measures, recording the purpose and function of each device I installed. The refrigerator was my first project. I installed a simple noise maker that would activate when the door opened, emitting a high-pitched beep at random intervals. Not loud enough to be considered harassment, but annoying enough that it could not be ignored. The sound would seem to come from everywhere and nowhere thanks to small speakers hidden throughout the cabin. Next came the bathrooms. Motion sensors inside the doorways connected to small sprinkler heads installed in the ceiling. Nothing dramatic, just enough water to make someone uncomfortably damp and ruin carefully applied makeup or expensive hairstyles. The cabinet doors in the kitchen received special magnetic locks that would engage randomly after being opened, making them impossible to close properly. They would swing open at the most inconvenient moments, particularly when someone walked past them. The lighting system throughout the cabin was rewired to my specifications. Certain floorboards, when stepped on, would trigger a sequence that made the lights flicker in an irritating pattern, not enough to cause medical issues but sufficient to create discomfort and confusion. But my masterpiece was the hot tub on the back deck. Karen Matthews had specifically mentioned it in one of her violation notices, claiming it was improperly installed despite having been there for 20 years. I carefully rigged a system that would release harmless but extremely persistent blue dye into the water at a specific time. The dye was skin-safe, but would stain fabric permanently and skin for at least a week. It was the same type used in banks to mark stolen money, impossible to remove quickly. Throughout the process, I installed weatherproof cameras in the surrounding trees, carefully angled to capture the entire property. Each camera connected to cloud storage that I could access remotely, ensuring that whatever happened would be thoroughly documented. Every trap was checked and double-checked for safety. I was not looking to harm anyone physically, just to create consequences for their trespassing and planned party. Every modification was photographed and described in my journal, noting its purpose as a security measure against unauthorized entry. My phone rang as I was finishing the final installations. It was my old college roommate, Mark, calling from Oregon. "Hey, Thomas, still on for this weekend? The fishing up here has been amazing this season." "Absolutely," I confirmed. "I will be there Friday morning, looking forward to it." This trip had been planned months ago, but now it served a dual purpose, providing me with an airtight alibi hundreds of miles away from my cabin when the HOA board made their move. Mark and several other friends would vouch for my whereabouts throughout the weekend. The night before my departure, I took one final walk through my beloved space. My fingers trailed over handcrafted wooden surfaces as I mentally mapped where each trigger and sensor waited silently. The cabin looked exactly as it always had: warm, welcoming, rustic. Nothing visible betrayed the sophisticated system now woven into its fabric. I stepped onto the deck and looked out over the lake, moonlight glinting off the water. My grandfather had chosen this spot because it brought peace to his soul after returning from war. My father had taught me to fish from that shoreline. My mother had painted dozens of watercolors from this very deck. This place was worth fighting for. With a heavy sigh that transformed into resolute determination, I locked the door the next morning, armed the various systems with a simple remote, and drove away. My phone would alert me the moment anyone entered the property. The cameras would begin recording automatically. As I headed toward the interstate, I felt an unusual sense of calm. Karen Matthews wanted to experience my cabin firsthand. She would get exactly what she wished for, just not in the way she expected. Now all I had to do was wait. The alert came at exactly 7:42 p.m. on Saturday evening. I was sitting in my hotel room in Portland, nearly 600 miles from Pine Lake. My phone vibrated with the notification: motion detected at cabin front door. I opened my laptop immediately, connecting to the security system I had installed. Multiple camera feeds appeared on my screen, showing different angles of my property. Right on schedule, 3 luxury SUVs crunched up the gravel driveway. The lead vehicle was the now familiar white Range Rover. Karen Matthews exited first, her designer heels completely inappropriate for the woodland setting. She wore a white pantsuit that probably cost more than a month of my mortgage payments. 6 other people emerged from the vehicles, 4 men and 2 women, all dressed in expensive casual attire. They carried coolers, shopping bags, and what appeared to be cases of champagne. I watched with calculated patience as Karen approached my front door. With an air of entitlement that made my blood boil even from hundreds of miles away, she produced a key from her purse, one she had no legal right to possess. She inserted it into the lock with a flourish, turning to say something to her companions that made them all laugh. The door swung open, and Karen gestured grandly, ushering the board members into my home. The invasion had begun. Through the interior cameras, I observed them making themselves immediately at home. One man placed bottles of liquor on my handcrafted dining table, creating an impromptu bar. Another woman opened cabinets in my kitchen, pulling out my plates and glasses without permission. "God, look at this place," Karen said, her voice perfectly captured by my microphones. "Can you believe people actually live like this? So rustic." She emphasized the last word with obvious distaste. "Perfect example of what we need to eliminate from the North Shore," agreed a balding man in a golf shirt. "Imagine the modern properties we could build here instead." Karen ran her hand along my grandmother's antique sideboard. "Once we get the owner out, we can level all of this. The view alone makes this property worth millions with the right development." They continued exploring my cabin, criticizing everything from the hand-hewn beams to the family photos on the walls. One board member opened the refrigerator to store their drinks, triggering the first trap. A high-pitched electronic beep emanated from somewhere in the cabin, then stopped. 30 seconds later, it sounded again from a different location. "What is that noise?" asked one of the women, looking around in confusion. "Probably some cheap alarm system," Karen dismissed. "Ignore it." The party continued despite the intermittent beeping that now came from seemingly random locations throughout the cabin. They poured drinks, proposed toasts to property values and community standards, and made themselves entirely at home in a house they had no right to enter. The real entertainment began when one of the men excused himself to use the bathroom. I switched camera views to watch as he triggered the motion sensor inside the doorway. A fine mist of water sprayed from the ceiling, catching him completely by surprise. He emerged moments later with his silk shirt spattered with water, his carefully styled hair now dripping. "There is something wrong with the plumbing in there," he announced, trying to maintain his dignity while dabbing at his shirt with a napkin. Within the next hour, all of my carefully planned inconveniences began to take effect. Cabinet doors refused to stay closed, swinging open dramatically whenever someone walked past. The lights flickered in seizure-inducing patterns when certain floorboards were stepped on. The intermittent beeping continued, changing location and duration unpredictably. Yet the party continued. If anything, they drank more heavily as the annoyances mounted, as though determined to enjoy their unauthorized use of my property despite the strange occurrences. The climax arrived when Karen suggested they take advantage of the hot tub on the back deck. "This is actually the only decent feature of this place," she announced, champagne glass in hand. "Let us warm it up and really enjoy ourselves." 3 of them changed into swimwear they had apparently brought specifically for this purpose, Karen included. She wore a white designer bikini that probably cost more than most people's entire wardrobes. They turned on the jets and climbed in, champagne bottles and glasses arranged carefully around the edges. I watched the timer on my laptop. At precisely 10:30 p.m., the dye release activated. Through the night vision camera, I observed as the clear water suddenly turned a vivid blue. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Karen was the first to notice, screaming as she looked down at her rapidly discoloring skin. "What is happening?" she shrieked, frantically trying to climb out of the now blue water. "What is this stuff?" The other two hot tub occupants scrambled out as well, all of them now stained a bright blue that glowed almost neon under the deck lights. Their expensive swimwear was instantly ruined, and their skin looked like they had been dipped in paint. The chaos escalated when one of them rushed inside to the bathroom to try to wash off the dye, triggering the sprinkler system again. Another slipped on the kitchen floor, which had been treated with a thin layer of cooking oil that activated when a specific light switch was flipped. Within minutes, the party had devolved into complete mayhem. Blue-stained board members scrambled for the exits, slipping on floors, getting sprayed with water, and battling cabinet doors that seemed possessed. Their expensive clothes and dignity were in tatters. Karen Matthews was the last to leave, standing in my living room dripping blue dye onto the hardwood floors. She looked directly into one of my hidden cameras, though she did not know it was there, her expression a mixture of rage and dawning horror as she seemed to realize she had been caught in a trap of her own making. I leaned back in my hotel chair, watching justice unfold in real time, and allowed myself a small smile of satisfaction. I returned to my cabin early Monday morning, driving straight through the night after saying goodbye to Mark and my other friends in Oregon. The evidence of the unauthorized party was immediately apparent. Empty champagne bottles littered my kitchen counters. Glasses had been left unwashed in the sink. Blue stains marked the path from the hot tub to the bathroom and front door. Sunlight streamed through the windows as I methodically photographed every overturned chair, every abandoned glass, every empty bottle. The damage was substantial but not irreparable. More importantly, the evidence was perfect. My cabin still smelled of spilled alcohol and expensive perfume, and something else: victory. I downloaded the security footage to my laptop, then made copies onto multiple thumb drives. The videos told the complete story in perfect high definition. Karen, using her unauthorized key to enter my property. The board members making themselves at home without permission. Their disparaging comments about my cabin, and their explicit discussions about forcing me out to develop the land. Most damning were the numerous mentions of their strategy to use HOA violations and fines to pressure me into selling. The footage captured Karen specifically stating, "Once we get the owner out, we can level all of this." Every word, every action, every intention had been recorded in perfect clarity. I was reviewing the footage at my dining table when the doorbell rang with predictable fury around noon. I opened the door to find Karen Matthews standing on my porch. Her skin still retained a faint blue tinge despite obvious extensive scrubbing. The dye had settled into the fine lines around her eyes and stained her cuticles, making her look like she was wearing strange blue makeup. Designer sunglasses failed to hide her rage, and her knuckles were white around the leather portfolio she clutched. "How dare you?" she hissed, not bothering with pleasantries. "You deliberately sabotaged your property to assault board members conducting an official inspection." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I was not even here this weekend. I was fishing in Oregon with friends. There were no scheduled inspections of my property that I authorized. As HOA president, I do not need your authorization for inspections, she snapped. "You will be hearing from our attorneys. The damage to my skin, my clothing, the emotional distress alone will cost you your property and more. I am filing charges for assault, booby-trapping, and intentional infliction of distress." "Interesting allegations," I said calmly. "And how exactly did you enter my property for this supposed inspection?" "I have inspection rights as outlined in Section 12 of the bylaws," she said, her voice rising. "We had every right to be here. Section 12 permits scheduled visual inspections of exteriors from common areas, or with 72 hours written notice for interior inspections," I replied. "It does not permit unauthorized key duplication, entrance without permission, or hosting parties in private residences. Furthermore, there were no traps here, just some unfortunately timed plumbing issues and an experimental dye test in my hot tub that I was conducting for algae control." I reached inside the door and picked up a thumb drive I had placed on the entry table. "Before you continue with your threats, you should know that trespassing, unauthorized use of property, and destruction exceeding $5,000 moves this into felony territory." The color drained from what visible parts of her face remained untinted. "What is that?" "Complete video and audio recording of Saturday night. Every minute from every angle. Your unauthorized entry using a duplicated key. Your statements about forcing me to sell. Your explicit plans to demolish my family home for development. Your board members drinking my liquor, using my property without permission, and causing damage." She took a step back. "You cannot record people without their consent." Actually, in this state, property owners can legally record security footage on their own property without notification or consent. I checked very carefully before installing the system. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times before she turned abruptly and stormed back to her Range Rover, the vehicle's tires spraying gravel as she accelerated away from my cabin. That afternoon, I sent a carefully edited 2-minute compilation video to every HOA board member. The clip showed Karen using her unauthorized key, her statements about forcing me out, and the board members making themselves at home in my cabin. I included a simple message: "We should discuss this at an emergency board meeting. Copies of the complete footage have been secured with my attorney." By evening, my phone rang constantly with neighbors offering support and sharing similar stories. Frank Miller brought dinner and sat on my deck, shaking his head in disbelief as I showed him portions of the footage. "She has been trying to force out all of us original owners," he said, "but you caught her red-handed, or I guess blue-handed now." Margaret Patterson called to inform me that she had spoken with her son, a real estate attorney in the city. "He says you have them dead to rights, Thomas. What they did was criminal trespass at minimum. The conspiracy to force sales through abusive HOA tactics could actually be prosecuted as racketeering." By nightfall, the community had divided clearly into two camps: the original cabin owners rallying behind me, and the newer residents watching in shocked silence as their HOA leadership imploded in a scandal tinged bright blue. The Pine Lake Community Center had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. All eyes fixed on the projection screen at the front of the room where I had connected my laptop. The emergency HOA meeting had been called for 7:00 p.m., just 3 days after the trespassing incident. I stood calmly at the podium, facing the board members who sat behind their long table looking distinctly uncomfortable. Karen Matthews had been placed at the far end, isolated from the others. A stern-looking woman in a charcoal suit sat beside her, occasionally whispering in her ear. The lawyer had arrived too late to save her client from what was about to unfold. Thank you all for coming tonight, I began. I have called this emergency meeting to address a serious violation of homeowner rights and abuse of HOA authority that occurred this past weekend. The room was silent as I presented my evidence methodically. First came the footage of Karen using her illegally duplicated key to enter my cabin without permission. Next, the video showed board members making themselves at home, setting up a bar on my dining table, and openly discussing their plans to force me to sell. The community reaction moved from shocked murmurs to outright calls for resignation as particularly damning footage played. When the screen showed Karen explicitly stating, "Once we get the owner out, we can level all of this," followed by discussion of the development potential of my property, the room erupted in angry shouts. "This is not what the HOA was formed to do," called out one of the newer residents, a retired judge who had built a home on the South Shore 2 years earlier. "This is criminal behavior." I let the evidence speak for itself, moving methodically through the footage of the unauthorized party, the trespassing, and the property damage. When I finally displayed the documented history of targeted harassment against original cabin owners, alongside development plans found on Karen's abandoned clipboard revealing intention to replace existing structures with luxury condominiums, the mood in the room turned decisively hostile toward the board. The other board members scrambled to distance themselves, claiming ignorance of their president's actions. "I had no idea Karen was planning to use the cabin without permission," insisted the treasurer, a nervous man who kept tugging at his collar. "We were told this was an authorized inspection tour followed by a board discussion at an approved venue." Karen finally stood, her lawyer attempting to pull her back down without success. "This is ridiculous. The inspection was completely within my rights as HOA president. The property had multiple violations that needed documentation. If some practical jokes were played on us during our official duties, that only proves the homeowner's malicious intent." I calmly loaded another video clip. "This was recorded at the community meeting last week. I believe it clarifies the true purpose of your visit." The room fell silent as Karen's own voice filled the speakers. "We will use that eyesore cabin for our after-party. The owner never attends these meetings anyway." Followed by, "Of course I have a key. As HOA president, I have access rights for inspection purposes. The bylaws are quite clear." Her face, still bearing a faint blue tint, had turned pale beneath the discoloration. Her lawyer was now the one standing, announcing that her client would make no further statements. The resolution came with surprising swiftness. The board called for an immediate vote of no confidence in Karen's leadership.